On the western edge of El Paso, Texas, there is a dam that was never supposed to make the news. It has sat there for decades, quiet, unremarkable, holding back a reservoir most residents didn't know existed. This week, that changed. Engineers watching its embankment noticed something moving that should never move. Not water over the top, not a crack in the concrete. The entire structure itself was beginning to shift. Cement Lake Dam, also known as the Portland Cement Reservoir, sits above a floodplain that stretches through some of the most densely populated corridors in West Texas. Downtown El Paso, the Upper Valley, Sunland Park, just across the state line in New Mexico, Las Cruces and the wider Mesilla Valley, further downstream along the dry bed of the Rio Grande. Altogether, more than 200,000 people live in the path that water would take if this dam gave way. For as long as most of them have lived there, this reservoir has been background infrastructure, the kind of thing you drive past without a second thought. It was built to hold water back, not to become the story itself. Earthen dams like this one exist by the thousands across the American Southwest, most of them built decades ago for flood control and water storage in a region defined by drought and sudden violent rainstorms. They aren't designed to be dramatic. They're designed to be forgotten, a quiet piece of infrastructure doing its job in the background while the desert around it stays dry. That's precisely what made this week's development so unsettling to the engineers watching it happen. There was no storm surge overwhelming the structure, no sudden flood testing its limits, just years of gradual wear showing up all at once in the exact way dam safety officials train for and hope never to see in real life. That began to change when engineers conducting routine assessments found something they were not expecting: slow-rate slope failures along the embankment, slight but measurable movement in the earthen structure, and most concerning of all, water seepage, appearing in places it had no business appearing. In dam safety, seepage is never just seepage. It is water finding a path through material that is supposed to be impermeable, and once it finds that path, it tends to keep finding more of it. El Paso Water, the utility responsible for the dam, issued an urgent update. Conditions, they said, had worsened. Engineers were now observing signs that increased the risk of a potential breach. This was not a routine maintenance notice. This was a warning that a structure holding back a reservoir was showing behavior consistent with failure. Here's what most coverage of this story is missing. This is not a concrete dam with a single obvious failure point. It's an earthen dam, built from compacted soil, held together by its own mass and careful engineering. And if the internal structure fails, it often does not fail slowly with a visible crack. It can fail suddenly, and by the time you see the water moving where it shouldn't be, the timeline for evacuation has already started shrinking. The National Weather Service issued a flood watch for western El Paso and southern New Mexico, stretching through Friday evening. That alone tells you how seriously officials are treating this. But the detail that has caught outsized attention isn't the water. It's what's tangled up in the floodplain below the dam's outlet. Razor wire. Stop for a second and picture that. If the dam fails, the floodwater wouldn't just be fast-moving and destructive on its own. It would potentially carry loops of razor wire downstream, tangled into debris fields, submerged and invisible until it isn't. For emergency crews attempting water rescues in a breach scenario, that transforms an already dangerous operation into something far more hazardous. This is the detail that changes how first responders would even approach a rescue. So, what happens if this dam actually fails? El Paso Water's own assessment offers some reassurance here. A spokesperson noted that, as of Friday afternoon, there were no residents in immediate danger because a breach would send water into the dry riverbed of the Rio Grande rather than directly into occupied structures. But no immediate danger is a very different statement from no danger. Roads throughout the potential inundation zone have already been closed. The City-County Office of Emergency Management activated its full Emergency Operations Center, not a step taken for a minor concern. Think about what that activation actually means. An EOC doesn't spin up for a dam that's merely being monitored as a precaution. It spins up when officials need real-time coordination between water utilities, law enforcement, road crews, and federal engineers. The kind of coordination you only need when multiple outcomes are still on the table, and one of them is bad enough to require an immediate response. Consider what a full breach scenario looks like in practice. Earthen dam failures don't release their reservoirs gently. When the internal structure of compacted soil gives way, water moves through the breach at a speed and volume that can carve out sections of the embankment within minutes, accelerating the release rather than slowing it. Downstream, that means a wall of water and debris moving through washes and roadways that most days carry nothing at all. Nearby homes are reportedly on higher ground and not expected to be directly impacted, but the area and directly impacted are doing a lot of work in that sentence, and officials know it, which is why evacuation planning and road closures remain active even as they try to project calm. Crews have already pumped out roughly 30 inches of water from the reservoir in an effort to relieve pressure on the failing embankment, but internal estimates suggest as much as 10 feet may ultimately need to be removed to genuinely stabilize the structure. That is not a project measured in hours. It's measured in however long the dam holds while the water level drops around it. A race between engineering intervention and a structure that is already moving. To understand why an earthen dam behaves this way, it helps to think about what's actually holding the water back. A concrete dam resists water pressure through the strength of a single rigid material. An earthen dam works differently. It relies on compacted layers of soil and clay functioning almost like a sponge that's been squeezed so tightly it becomes solid, with an impermeable core preventing water from moving through. The moment water finds a path through that core, through a root channel, an animal burrow, a zone of looser compaction, anything, it begins eroding a tunnel from the inside out. Engineers call this piping because the water carves something that behaves exactly like an underground pipe, invisible from the surface until the ground above it collapses. Here's the part that makes piping so dangerous. From the outside, an embankment can look completely stable for weeks while the erosion tunnel grows underneath it, inch by inch, entirely out of sight. The first visible symptom is often the last warning you get, a slump in the slope, a patch of ground that suddenly looks wetter than it should. By the time engineers see cloudy or sediment-heavy water in the seepage, they're often not watching the beginning of the problem. They're watching its later stages. Slope failure and seepage are the visible symptoms of a process that may already be well underway beneath the embankment's surface. That's why crews aren't just watching the outside of the dam. They're trying to reduce the pressure that's driving water through it in the first place. Because once piping starts, lowering the reservoir may be the only thing standing between a stable structure and a catastrophic one. Zoom out, and the real story here isn't really about one aging reservoir in the desert. It's about how many similar structures exist across the country that nobody thinks about until the week they start moving. More than 200,000 people live in the communities downstream of Cement Lake Dam. Downtown El Paso, the Upper Valley, Sunland Park, Las Cruces, and the broader Mesilla Valley. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the population of Salt Lake City, spread across a floodplain that most years sees no water at all. Crews from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers have been brought in to advise on stabilization, which tells you this isn't being treated as a local maintenance issue anymore. It's being treated as a structure under active watch for failure. For the families living along the Rio Grande's dry bed, this has meant a strange kind of waiting. Roads they drive every day are suddenly barricaded. Neighbors are checking in on each other, comparing what they've heard from the news against what they've heard from utility workers going door to door. EP Water has said the homes nearest the dam sit on higher ground and aren't expected to be directly impacted. But for anyone living within sight of that embankment, not expected to be directly impacted is a sentence that invites a second look at the exit routes out of their own neighborhood. Residents in the affected zones have been told to avoid closed roadways and follow evacuation guidance if conditions change. For a community that has never had to think about this dam, that is an enormous mental shift to make in the span of a single week, from background infrastructure to the single thing determining whether tonight is ordinary or not. So where does this go from here? Crews are continuing to lower the reservoir, watching the embankment for any sign that slope movement is accelerating rather than stabilizing. The number worth watching isn't the volume of water pumped out, It's whether the seepage rate keeps dropping as the water level falls, because that would suggest the internal pressure driving the failure is easing. If the seepage doesn't slow, or if new movement appears in a different section of the embankment, that would be the signal that this structure hasn't stabilized at all. It's simply running out of time on a different schedule than engineers hoped. Nobody can say with certainty which outcome this becomes. What we do know is that a routine reservoir in the Texas desert just proved, in a matter of days, exactly how quickly aging infrastructure can turn into an emergency nobody had on their radar. Subscribe to Stay Ahead of What's Coming.